Flawedcast, episode 102, Perception Triumphs Over Deception. If we take the generally accepted definition of bravery as a quality which knows no fear, I have never met a brave man. All men are frightened. The more intelligent they are, the more they are frightened. General George S. Patton. Flawedcast.
Get in the arena.
All right, everybody, I want to welcome you to a brand new episode of Flawedcast. As always, my trusty side chick.
Side chick. My trusty side chick.
Nice. Carl. How's it going, my friend?
Good morning. It's going well, as it always does. How are you this morning? I never get to ask you how you're doing.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I'm good. Hanging tough, like New Kids on the Block. And
well, you look chipper and spry.
Thank you.
So if the appearance is any indication, we're in for a good one today, huh?
I think we are. Actually, it's probably the pot of coffee I've already consumed this morning. But nonetheless, this heart runs on caffeine and hate.
Well, the coffee is the steroid of the heart. I mean, the heart's a muscle. The more coffee you drink, the better in shape your heart is.
Boom. Did Fauci tell you that?
Of course he did. I just met with him yesterday. We were going over the game plans for opposite sides.
Nice.
Strategy attacks.
Controlled opposition. All right. Anyway, hey, listen, a couple things real quick. I'm involved in a podcast with some former guests, Baron Tim Hickey and Big Daddy Ed Jones. They're starting a new podcast called The Honorable Man Podcast. I'm producing it. I'm helping them get on their feet and get started. So I just want to give a shout out. They've been really nice. They have shared values, shared belief systems, and happy to be with those guys. They're just some top shelf individuals. Coming January 3rd, a bunch of their episodes are going to be up there. So when you listen to us, make sure you listen to them, give them some love, but also make sure that you share and subscribe. We are asking you guys to share. That is how you get in the arena with fighting for the side of good and for the side of righteousness. Sharing this podcast, subscribing, anywhere you can listen to podcasts, you can find us under Flawedcast or Flawedcast CLE, Apple, Google Play, Spotify, Breaker, Radio Public. We are on Rumble. We're on YouTube. That's under Flawed Inc. You can find us on the Project Mockingbird social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Parler, Gab, MeWe. That's under Flawed Inc. Get a copy of my book, Smith's Heart of Man Repair Manual, link below. Great Christmas gift for the men in your life. If you don't know what to get them, hit us up. I have some here. I'd be more than happy to sign one for you. With that being said, Carl did such a great job doing the Pledge of Allegiance last week. I think we're going to just let him run with that.
Well, I don't know if this is going to be my new position, but I was honored last week. It made me feel like I was back in kindergarten in Mrs. Gardner's class, standing at my desk back in the good old days in 1975.
Back in the day.
It took me down a trip to memory lane where we all crossed our heart and we spoke in unison while staring at the flag. Those were the good old days in public school. Do they still do that? I don't know.
I really don't know.
My kids are older. They're out of school. I haven't asked the grandkids. I'm just wondering if that still happens.
Let us know. Send us a comment or a message.
Yeah, I'm sincere when I ask that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Just put a comment on the link below when you're listening and let us know. I really would be interested also in knowing that.
Yeah, it's something that...
and I just assumed, I guess. But... you know what happens when you assume.
Yeah, so. Well, it's just something to say. All right, everyone.
All right, ready?
Let's take our right hand, put it over your left heart, and repeat after us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, that feels good.
Yes, that was...
The air, I think, is cleared. And, you talk about a gentleman like George Patton, who I guess my grandfather served under in the European theater.
Wow.
We're not trying to trigger anybody. We're not trying to call anybody on the carpet. We're not trying to do anything other than speak frankly and directly in a message that is to be encouraging, hopefully timely, and hopefully something that's going to fortify you with grit and with the hand of the Almighty to your back in regards to if you go to a church or if you're part of a group or if you see what's going on and you're afraid, or maybe you've taken these jabs because you didn't want to lose your job, or maybe, this or that, and you are just surrounded and engulfed in an anxiety anxiety and depression and fear, and that's controlling and manipulating you. We are speaking directly to those things, to the hearts of men and women, that hopefully they're going to be able to stand in defiance of this evil that is flagrantly mocking us in every arena in life. So
I was thinking today really of my Christian heritage and Southern church, even in the northern states, because of the people that were in charge, the pastors and
denominational,
going to college in the Bible Belt, where the guys would come in with a three-piece suit to class carrying their Bible, and I would come in with a pair of sweats and a t-shirt and my tennis shoes, and didn't need the Bible because I pretty much through private school had been taught the Bible and could quote quite a bit of it, so it wasn't really necessary to bring it in. But to come from a churched upbringing and yet be able to reach out of that to the unchurched. And what I mean by the unchurched is non-traditional, non-religious of systems of rules of man. And to yet, that's where I came from. That was my roots. Like that was my beginning and my education and my upbringing, and it's been my memories. But God several times plucked me away from that and put me in isolation through situations where I was alone.
Life happens.
Yeah. And I mean, as a younger kid, as a teenager, and during those times of isolation where I was by myself, you know what I did? I just reached out to God in those alone times. And God kind of showed me and revealed to me a side of himself that was what he wanted me to know outside of tradition and outside of religion. And he kind of formed my way of thinking about him in that times of isolation. And, you know, I have a kindred spirit to David, not because I would qualify as a man after God's own heart, but David was also in isolation as a youth. David had a lot of time out there in the fields tending to the sheep, where it was just him, the sheep, and God. And so I thank God for the way he planned my life, he shaped my life. And I wanted to speak to the people that are listening now that you may not be churched. And what I mean by that is that you may not be a regular church attender. You may not have been educated in the religious system. But everything right now can be broken down into two categories: good and evil. And that is it. Now, society would want to say Democrat and Republican, progressive, conservative. They would like to label everything in different categories, but I truly believe that everything that is happening today, it can be put into two categories: good and evil. And within those two subheadings falls many topics. But if you're listening to us and you view yourself as unchurched or you don't qualify, I'm speaking to these people today, I think. If you are standing for the good, you are standing for God. And I want you to embrace that. I want these people to embrace the fact you don't have to be labeled as churched. You don't have to come from a certain background. But if you're seeing what is happening at this time in history and you feel like you are going to stand for the good, you, my friend, are standing for God. And I just want to set that tone going forward.
And I would say it's not coincidental. Meaning there is an awakening to your senses, if you will, that I believe can only come from the Almighty, because there's so much deception and there's so much manipulation. And like Carl was saying, whether you were raised in a custom or a tradition of church attendance or a religious or denominational system or not, I wasn't. So I can relate just as well. If you have an understanding of the hour we're living in, and you have a clear recognition of good and evil, light and dark, righteous and unrighteous, that is a gift given to you from the Almighty. And as that gift is being stirred and awakened in people, I would say even at this moment listening, that you are being called not to a second or third string position, that you are called on as a frontline individual. There is no essential or non-essential in this fight. That's another label that have been forced upon us. But I would also say that, and we're going to get into it, I think, in a little bit here, but the power to overcome fear and anxiety and doubt and depression is within you. We're going to give you hopefully some things that help us, but will help you, and that you can stand confidently. And if nothing else, know that at least Carl and I are standing with you, as is the hand of the Almighty. So
I want to make a statement right now.
Yeah, do it.
That overpowered my mind in prayer this morning. And I know that when I get a thought, I know which thoughts are crazy, right? And I know which thoughts are God speaking to me. When I have my own thoughts, they're nuts. Like, they're crazy, okay? They're psychotic. When I have a thought that moves me and it overpowers me and it stays with me, I've learned at this age to recognize, to embrace the Holy Spirit's leading in the way that he's speaking to me. Perception overcomes deception. And I'm going to
say that again.
Perception overcomes deception. Satan's only attack that he has is to deceive. The Bible says he is the liar, and not only that, but he is the father of all lies. That's what the Bible says, and that's what I believe he is. He's been identified. I'm going to get farther down the road in this podcast. I'm going to bring to you what was brought to me today in prayer, and it is a perfect example of how proper perception overcomes deception. But I just wanted to throw that out there because as people are driving, doing their laundry, cooking dinner, shooting their gun in between firing and listening, fishing, ice fishing, I guess, whatever you're doing, get that in your mind. I think that's today's theme. Proper perception overcomes deception. I just wanted to throw that out there.
No. That's great. Well, if they are shooting, praise the Lord and pass the ammo.
Yeah, we have to ask ourselves the question, Bill. How is it possible for two people to be looking at the same thing or the same event and they're seeing something different? They're looking at the same thing, but they're seeing something different. And that thought kind of got into my mind based on what I feel is happening right now. Everyone is looking at the same thing, but everyone is seeing things differently, even though they're viewing the same thing.
Well, that's interesting. Like, you consider a crime, a crime may have 10 witnesses and you may have 10 people that watch the same event, but their perception is 10 different things.
And I would state this, I truly believe that it's how you're looking at it. And I'm going to give an example out of the Bible of this.
Okay, I'll allow that.
Yeah. So David was a teenager boy. And David's brothers, 3 of them, were in the Israeli army. Israel was in battle with the Philistines. The Philistines had a hero named Goliath, who was a giant.
Who we talked about, episode 99, the Die Human episode.
Yes, we did.
Part of the Nephilim and that.
Yes.
So just kind of reference everything, tie everything in.
Yes. And so the Philistines were represented by Goliath. You had 2 nations and you had 2 armies. And Goliath said, every morning as he would go down into the valley between the 2 hills, send me your best warrior. If I defeat him, we win the war. If you kill me, you win the war. The challenge really didn't make sense. That is unconventional warfare. Like, that is not the way that you fight a war. But this war had been shaped and formed and set up by Goliath in such a manner. And the reason was because of the arrogance and the pride that was in him. And I would make a side note here. Right now, in no other time of my life have I seen such arrogance and pride and conceit as I am witnessing come from the evildoers that are in positions of authority in power. They are oothing and soothing pride and arrogance and conceit. And that is what Goliath was doing, because in his mind, he knew he was undefeatable.
Just think of the pressure that if you're the one dude they pick from Israel, like, wow, if I tank this. But it's also what you're saying to me. It is the anxiety, but it's also another side of anxiety is fear. I think fear is ultimately that master. Even the idea of facing your fear, like the Patton quote, far as courage, I've never met a brave man. That's not the whole point. The point is facing and overcoming that fear. Most victories are won, and the first battle in that is overcoming their fear.
Absolutely. So you can begin reading this story for yourself in 1 Samuel chapter 17. I will briefly narrate and take us to a couple of key verses. But an interesting thing was that just the last episode and maybe the episode before, we covered the idea that says, what do you do when you don't choose a battle, but the battle chooses you? Yeah. Like, David's mission was laid out to him very clearly from his father. And that was 2 things. A, I would like you to take this food to your 3 brothers. Secondly, I want you to talk to them. I want you to find out how they're doing. And I want you to come back to me and give a report of how they're doing. So that was David's mission. That was David's instructions. That was what David was looking to do. David was not going to his brothers to fight a battle, to look at a battle. That was not what his purpose was.
Not even to report on the battle. It was like, here's some food. How are your brothers doing? Or they need anything? Blah, blah, blah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. He wasn't running intelligence. He wasn't doing any kind of counterintelligence.
Yes. Yeah. He would fall right into the category, coincidentally enough, of what we just covered last podcast, which was, what do you do when you're not looking for the battle, but the battle chooses you? Right. Now, this is where David found himself, okay? So he shows up to check on his brothers, to bring them food, and this was what the whole army of Israel was focusing on. This is what they were looking at, which shaped their perception of what they were facing. In verse 25, this is what it says. Now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. That was what they saw, right? They're looking at Goliath. They're looking at this giant, and their perception of this moment is there is a giant, which is described in scriptures, and they describe his size. They describe the intimidation he brings. But when it boils down to what they were looking at a man that was defying Israel. Listen what David saw, and listen at what David heard. In verse 26, David is looking at the same moment in time. David is looking at the same giant, but look at what he sees. So the Israeli army said he is defying Israel. That was their perception. David's perception is, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God? When David saw Goliath, he was not looking at a giant that was defying a nation. He was looking at a giant that was defying God. They were looking at the same thing, but David's perception was totally different because Goliath was defaming, mocking, ridiculing the name of God. Yeah. The military didn't want to see that part of what Goliath was doing. David only saw that part. David didn't even notice that he was a giant. David described him as a uncircumcised Philistine. The army described him as a giant. David was looking at the same event and seeing things totally different than the army. The army was afraid to go to battle. These men, Bill, they had been trained. They had fought other battles. They had been in warfare. And yet, with that experience and that perception of what war was, they were cowardice in the moment.
There's so many parallels that can be drawn to that right now. You're right. It is the perception, but by and large, as I'm sure you're about to get into here in a moment, that perception wasn't reality. That perception wasn't truth. It wasn't fact. It was how their purview at that moment, tainted, manipulated by fear, anxiety, depression, whatever, doubt, self-doubt, that changed, that shifted how they were looking at that particular place, that particular battle, that particular individual. And not to mention the guy had a whole army. They weren't even looking at the rest of the army. They were looking at this one dude.
Right.
So let's just say they each had 10,000 troops on each side. One person shifted the entire focus. It's the whole idea of let's put something and dangle something in front of you that will take your focus off of this or that. You know, like, oh, Ghislaine Maxwell is on trial for these rampant celebrity and political allegations, I'll say at this point, of mass pedophilia, Luciferianism practices. And all of a sudden, oh, there's Omicron. Oh, all of a sudden, Jesse Smollett's going to prison. Oh, all of a sudden this, all of a sudden that. As you're saying, that's how I'm picturing this.
Yeah, it is all deception being thrown out. And when I say deception, I mean when the Israeli army was looking at Goliath, it wasn't like they were looking at something that wasn't there. Yes, Goliath was a giant. Yes, Goliath was a warrior that was a hero to the Philistines and other countries knew. That's the reality.
He was Superman to them.
To them, he was. And maybe even he was. But the truth of the matter was, it wasn't the fact that he was a giant that stopped them from attacking him. What it was their perception of who he was. Because David didn't care about the size of Goliath. David cared about the mouth of Goliath and what was coming out of the mouth. So my position is, you are capable of being in a room with two people, seeing the same exact thing, and the way you perceive that thing dictates whether or not you overcome that thing, whether you defeat that thing, whether you triumph over that thing. That thing that is in front of you, that evil that is the opposition, that is not what defines whether or not you win or lose. It is the way that you look at it and the way you see it. And what are you focusing on? And that is literally what will propel you to, even though you are afraid, as General Patton said, you will become brave because you shift your focus.
I would even say I think a lot of people are afraid, even in this moment. Like, there's so many Goliaths. I just named a handful. I could spend the rest of the episode listing other things, but I think people are so caught off guard by whatever is in their life, and maybe they have succumbed to whatever that is. Maybe that they've had a moment or two or dozen of weakness, and that is something that's also haunting them. I would just want to say that isn't anything that should stop or hold you back from overcoming that fear. And I would also say, the only thing between a person who fails and a person who succeeds is that the person who succeeded got up one more time and tried.
Absolutely.
Overcome the fear, overcome that perception that they realized what was being leveled against them was a ruse. Once David, I don't want to jump in front of you, but once David did what he did, which was get in the arena, stood in defiance of the evil that was being hurled, perpetrated, infected, whatever you want to say, against not just him, but his brothers, his countrymen, more importantly, his God. At that moment, he beat Goliath. Most people, I think, have a basic understanding of David and Goliath, at least the analogy. And then after that, the entire Israeli army came to David's back, and this battle ensued.
Yes.
Where the Israeli army overcame the Philistines.
Yes, they did.
And it was a triumphant victory. But it started because one young man had the audacity, had the stones to stand in the face of tyranny and evil in that hour and say, no, I will not stand for this. And that one moment of holy defiance changed that nation for generations.
Yes. We talked also in the last podcast about accepting the fact that you're not capable or able, but you make yourself available. They really didn't need David if another soldier would have rose up and made theirself available.
Could have been one of his brothers.
It could have been. But the truth of the matter was, as God moves through a system and structure, he relies on man to open the door for miracles to follow. When men and women make themselves available, that's all it takes. I'm okay knowing I am not capable to fight this evil that exists. I'm okay to know that I am not able, but I will. Even though I may be afraid, even though I may not know how, I will be available. And whatever happens, happens. Overcome the fear of the outcome. The fear of the outcome from the Israeli army paralyzed them. That if I rise up, he's going to kill me. But their perception was wrong because they thought that they were going to fight him representing Israel. David went and fought Goliath representing God. And I had said earlier, there are two categories that things fall into right now at this time in history. There is no gray area. It is either good or it is evil. And there is no in between. There is no more comfort zone. They have removed that. It is gone. You will either fight on the side of good or you will fight on the side of evil. And when you stand for good, which is standing for God, Bill, in the Bible, it says that all good things come from God.
It's interesting that David's response before he engaged in the battle on the Philistine, Goliath said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." So still taunting, saber-rattling, what guys do. In 45, then David said to the Philistine, David said to Goliath, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have taunted. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and will give the corpses of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and to the wild beasts of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that his entire assembly may know that the Lord does not save with the sword or the spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us."
his cause of this involvement was different than the army of Israel's. David was fighting evil as a representative of God and made himself available to this giant and representing God, not just Israel. The Israeli army was focusing on one thing, and their perception was, we represent Israel and we fight this war, and that is who we're fighting for, and we're fighting against a Philistine. This was an issue of good and evil. That's what it was at the core.
But it's amazing to me how David had the spiritual acuity to not only recognize that and call it out, but as best he could walk into that he knew it wasn't his skill set. It was God, literally. And God does interact in the lives of humans still, even at this moment. And that is nothing short of what we're referring to here in this historically documented event that did occur in actual history.
Yeah, and the thing is, if you step back up to verse 42, I had said earlier, I've never seen such pride and arrogance and conceit as what I am seeing right now in the authoritarian organizations, with our politicians, and with the governments. I've never seen it. This is as arrogant and cocky and conceited as they've ever been. Listen what Goliath says. In verse 42, he looked David over. He saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome. Goliath hated the fact that David was a good-looking guy. Hated it. But more than that, he hated his opinion of himself being insulted by this little tiny boy, this insignificant challenge that was being brought to him. He was infuriated because of his pride. And listen at this. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Then the Philistine cursed David, "Come here, I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." I can see such a parallel right now with the way that the government views anyone that's speaking out, anyone that has an opposite view, anyone that questions them, because the tone that they're taking is, who do you think you are? Do you think I am a dog that you would stand and question me? Do you not know who we are and the positions that we hold? Why question us? That same conceit, that same arrogance, that same pride that Goliath had when he looked at the uprising that David brought was nothing more than just a little tiny boy who, yeah, he's cute, he's good looking, he's handsome, but I'm infuriated and I'm being made to be like a dog. And right now, any time a school board, a politician, an organization, an agency is questioned with anything, they have the same arrogant, prideful, conceited approach that says, who do you think you are? Shut your mouth, because if you don't, this is what we're going to do to you. And they start threatening us, and they tell us how they're going to put us in jail and how they're going to fine us and how we're going to lose our jobs. And they make all these threats and all these accusations that they throw at us because how dare you speak to us? Well, guess what? Goliath was wrong, and so are they.
I want to say two things. One, the same influence, the same spirit that was beaming out of Goliath is that same exact spirit that we are confronting now. It is that Antichrist spirit. And the second thing I want to say, and I'm going to maybe shift gears a little bit, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So there was an article that I came across, and I shared this with Carl earlier this week, and just to illustrate how division is one of the most effective tools in this army. Actually, I would probably argue to say it's one of the key tools that we are fighting. And Carl mentioned earlier, the Republican, Democrat, left, right, progressive, conservative, whatever. Even in realms of Christianity, you got Protestant and Catholicism. And my personal purview is that this current Pope, watch out for this dude. But there's a gentleman who is a high-ranking official in the Catholic Church. His name is Bishop Viajano. And this is a dude, but I really believe this guy knows the living God, that he knows and worships the living Christ by his example and by the fact that he is coming against the papacy in Rome. And and speaking these things. So this is an article, it just came out this week. It's called "Those Who Resist the New World Order Will Have the Help and Protection of God." This is an interview from the Gateway Pundit with Italian Archbishop Viagiano. I'm going to highlight what they asked him, and I'm going to read his response because I believe it lines up with what Carl was just referring to with references to David. The question says, when asked about spies attending masses of priests who warn their congregations about the perils of the COVID vaccine, the Archbishop replied, "I think that every priest has the right, or rather the duty, to warn his faithful about real danger, not at all merely hypothetical, represented by the inoculation of this experimental medical product. This is especially the case when the entire psychopandemic farce clearly aims to lead towards the establishment of a dictatorship whose purpose is to control the citizens through a violation of their constitutional and natural rights under the guise of health emergency." At another point, the Archbishop warned about the preparation that took place for the pandemic. The operation required meticulous preparation and needed the participation of large parts of the public, institutions, and private sectors, including the complicity of the judiciary, of law enforcement, and the media. These combined efforts are a real coup d'etat, and the pandemic is just the prophasis through which is introduced the seeming inevitability of the violation of the fundamental rights and the consequent establishment of the totalitarian regime of the New World Order. In this new order, the pandemic superstition reigns supreme with its magicians and its vaccine templates, its irrational rituals, and the excommunication of sinners, or those to be shunned, those who do not agree to give up their reason, even therefore apostatizing from the faith in order to embrace this insane ideological madness. The New World Order is neither new nor order. It represents the foolish ambitions of Satan to overthrow the providential plan of God, to cancel the true religion that leads to eternal salvation, and finally to replace the Ordo Christianus, the Christian order, with infernal chaos. In this disorder, the lie replaces the truth, injustice and abuse of power replaces justice, whim instead of obedience, and the law of God, death instead of life, illness instead of health, the legitimizing of evil and the condemnation of good, the persecution of good people and the praising of evil ones, ignorance in the place of culture and wisdom, ugliness and horror instead of beauty, division and hatred instead of harmony and love. Satan doesn't want to be worshipped by adopting the qualities of God, but by demanding to be an object of admiration through everything that is evil, obscene, false, absurd, and monstrous. He seeks complete subversion, a subversion ontologically devilish and antichristic, a quote-unquote new world order obtained by means of a global coup d'etat imposed under the guise of the engineered planned emergency. The vaccine campaign, lacking any scientific validity, serves first of all as the apparent legitimization of implementing global tracking and controls today under the pretext of limiting COVID spread, a pretext which is false because, among other reasons, the vaccinated can still become infected and contagious. But tomorrow, this campaign aims to expand its reach, expanding the quote-unquote green pass to include information used in a social credit system to confront a quote-unquote green emergency, which will be likewise false and specious. The quote-unquote green pass is being conceived as something like the mark of the beast mentioned in the Apocalypse of St. John to forbid people to buy, sell, travel, spend, and live. So that being said, I think what the bishop was referring to when he says it is the duty of every priest, I would say of every pastor, of every layman, of every person, I would even go as far to say, listening to this, it is your duty, it is your responsibility to stand in defiance of evil, especially after you've recognized it.
Yes, I want to be involved in the end times by just simply doing what I know, like committing to make myself available. And, we've talked several times on this podcast about the idea of starting your day by shaping your mind, of taking the control of your mind and programming, processing it your way. Taking control back, right? And I just want to be ready for each moment. And I think you don't have to be a pastor or a priest, but you definitely don't have to be in that position to be available. You just have to be alive and recognize. You have to have your perception fixed. I think that has been the biggest thing personally for me that has helped me in this time period, was that my perception, even though I know that I was a Christian, I know I loved God, I know my heart, I know what my desires were, but even in that, I needed to have an end time perception of where things were, how things really are, and where things are going. And it was like, that's what I speak about when I say waking up in the matrix or waking up in the simulation, is that, oh my gosh, I'm seeing this stuff now because my perception has changed. And perception is reality. David's reality was Goliath isn't so big. He's not so bad, because once Goliath talked his trash to David, David started talking his trash. And actually, this little teenager not only held his own, but he spanked Goliath not just in battle of war, but at the battle of the trash talking and telling him, this is what you're doing against my God. This is what I'm going to do to you. And what David told Goliath he was going to do to him was a lot worse than what Goliath told David he was going to do to David. So he didn't just stand there and fight. Before he fought, he spoke to his giant.
I would say that what he did was got in the arena. I think there's this pervasive idleness. If you just go along to get along, that if you don't make a ruckus, that if you're a good part of the proletarian, I'm not going to have to deal with it. Things will go back to normal. This, and this. I believe that is part of the deception in regards to the perception, because we know throughout history that evil, tyrannies, and now, to quote Archbishop Viajano, this New World Order, they aren't going to relent.
No.
Your acquiescence, your capitulation is going to do nothing but push you further and further under their thumb. And as I think about this, one of my favorite fictional books is 1984, written by George Orwell. And when O'Brien is talking to Winston and he says, you know what the future looks like, Winston? It looks like a boot stomping on the face of humanity. That is what your capitulation and your acquiescence and your going along to getting along will bring to you.
Yeah, I think my final appeal for the podcast is simple. Recognize the moment in history. There's no more gray. Evil cannot coexist with good. It just isn't possible. In the past generations, I think because we weren't targeted directly as much and left alone, we were okay as long as evil impacted and hurt other people. Now, that sounds terrible to say, but if you're going to make a difference in today's times, you're going to have to say the hard things, and you're going to have to, you can do it with love, but you got to tell the truth. The truth is, as long as it's in somebody else's backyard and it's not mine and they're leaving me alone, I'm okay. But that time's gone. The truth of the matter is, evil will not coexist with good. And so you're confronted with one of two choices. You're going to pick a side. There is no more gray area. There are no more safe places, okay? You will either be a hand in the tool of God and standing up for good, or the idea of being complicit, that's also gone. Because I think things have shifted now to where you're not complicit, but you're an accessory. Because my mission is, Bill, those that are innocent, those proclaiming Christians, if up until now you have been unaware, I'm okay with that. If up until now you believed things may change and go back to your comfort zone, I'm okay with that. But I'm here to tell you now, it is time to recognize. It is time to accept. The truth of the matter is, it's not going back. It's only going to get worse. The battle has chosen you. You can either be an accessory. Yeah, that's a strong word. You're not complicit anymore. You're accessorying. You are contributing. Because if you're not speaking out and you can't recognize the difference, my friend, you are not just not fighting evil. You are standing for it. It is that simple. And I know this is as strong as I've ever spoken on a podcast about what is happening. But I feel compelled that you understand this may be out of character of what my role has been here, what I've said. But I'm feeling propelled to tell you, you that if God were able to show up in the flesh, he would tell you, the time for you to be unaware is over. The time for the blinds to be on your eyes is over. If you can't recognize what is happening and discern the difference, my friend, you have now shifted from complicit to being a partaker and being an accessory in establishing this evil. There is no more gray area.
With that, I concur. I agree. And you need to take that to heart. You really need to take what he just said to heart. And I would also say that, I don't know if I can word it as eloquently, but I would say that hard times call for hard decisions. And when you're making your decisions, when you're choosing your side, that's not always going to be the easiest thing to do. Probably going to ruffle some feathers, but I would say it's probably better to shake the boat than you to be shaken. And I 100% agree with his assessment. I've been telling people, I personally believe before the midterms next year, we're going to see a completely different America. I personally think that if you are listening to podcasts like this, if you're listening to people who are speaking the truth, you need to start listening to people who speak truth, and not just listening and taking it in, but cataloging it, saving it, because there's going to be a day when you're not going to be able to hear these kind of things. The government is now completely handed over to the ruler of the air, and we are in that time. So you need to take nothing for granted. You listening to this episode and you being warned, you being lovingly warned that this is where we're at. The choice is yours. Choose life or choose death. Choosing life on this side of eternity might bring you death, but that is the true life. And at that, I'm just going to be quiet. So I do want to thank you guys for listening. Please share. I know that people listening to this know people that need to hear it. Please share this with them. I don't care. People don't need to know me. People don't need to know Carl. People need to know Christ. And they need to know the hour that we're in. And they need to know that the only choices they have is stand in defiance of evil with the power of the Almighty at your back, or acquiesce and take a knee to this Antichrist system. Wherever you can listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google Play, Breaker, Radio Podcast. We're on Rumble, YouTube, Flawedcast, Flawedcast CLE, Flawed Inc. We're on the Project Mockingbird social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Parler, Gab, MeWe. That's at Flawed Inc. Get my book, Smith's Heart of Man Repair Manual. Link is below. Make sure you check out on January 3rd, the Audible Man podcast. My buddies Baron Tim and Big Daddy Ed. And Merry Christmas.